Imagine you're in your 20s. You just moved out from your parents, maybe started university or your first job, are in your first serious relationship. Life is looking good. And then something shifts. You cannot sleep. You grow restless, start pacing up and down your room. You start to think that others are out there to get you. And you hear voices that say nasty things about you. This is what psychosis can look like. So welcome to this crash course in psychosis. My name is Katharina Schmack. I'm a psychiatrist and neuroscientist. That means I went to medical school and specialized in psychiatry, and I'm now working as a psychiatrist at the NHS here in North London. I'm also a neuroscientist, which means that I completed doctoral and postdoctoral training and a research fellowship in the US, and I'm now leading a group here at the Francis Crick Institute. So my weeks are split between these two worlds. I care for people with severe mental illness in the clinic, and I study the biological roots of these very conditions here in the lab. And while I've drawn my path with this very straight line, the reality of it felt much more chaotic. But through it all, there was one common thread that has guided me, and that is my fascination with psychosis. So, what is psychosis? Psychosis is a state in which perceptions and beliefs detach from reality. There are two core features of psychosis: hallucinations and delusions. Hallucinations are perceptions without an external cause. Very often, people with psychosis hear voices that others cannot hear. For example, a young woman I once met heard a running commentary on her every move. She's opening the door now, she's going to the kitchen, she's sitting down, she looks nervous. Imagine living with that day in, day out. Hallucinations can also be visual, seeing a shadow in the corner that vanishes when you look again, or tactile, feeling that someone is touching you when there is no one. Some people even feel sensations inside their body. For example, they may feel that they have a device implanted in their head that is recording their thoughts. Now, delusions are beliefs that are deeply held but that don't fit the evidence. Very often, these beliefs are threatening and frightening. People may feel followed or persecuted. For example, one young man I once met, he was convinced that his neighbors had installed cameras all throughout his flat and were watching him and live streaming his life on the internet. And he checked and could not find these cameras, but the belief remained unshaken. Now, delusions can also take other forms. People may feel that they are uniquely chosen or on a special mission, or that they carry unbearable guilt that they may not possibly have caused. So these experiences are not made up. They feel utterly real because they come from the same brain machinery that creates all our sense of reality. So psychosis is usually the sign of a serious underlying condition. And there are a variety of conditions that come with psychosis. A useful way to think about this is to divide them into primary psychosis and secondary psychosis. In primary psychosis, we don't know yet the cause for every individual. The most well-known primary psychotic disorder is schizophrenia, where people experience psychotic episodes and sometimes psychotic symptoms can persist between these episodes. Schizophrenia can also bring what we call negative symptoms, a loss in motivation or less pleasure in everyday life. And it can bring cognitive difficulties, such as difficulties with planning or with concentration. Psychosis can also happen in bipolar disorder, which is primarily a mood disorder. In bipolar disorder, psychosis usually reflects the underlying mood. So in depressive episodes, psychosis can be quite negative. People may hear demeaning negative voices, or they may, for example, have the delusion that they have lost everything when in reality they have not. In mania, psychosis can be expansive. People may feel that they have special powers and that they are invincible. And that can lead them to take risks and be quite dangerous. Schizoaffective disorder is a little bit in between. It has features from both schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And one rare but very urgent form of psychosis is postpartum psychosis, which happens to women after childbirth, in the days or weeks after childbirth. And it is really important to get urgent help because it can be quite dangerous for the mother and the baby. Now, secondary psychotic disorders are those where we do know a likely cause. For example, substance use can cause psychosis, especially when these substances are used chronically or heavily in individuals that have a predisposition for psychosis. Head injury can be a trigger for psychosis. And certain autoimmune diseases, where the body's own defenses turn against the brain and cause brain inflammation, these conditions can also cause psychosis. And in neurodegenerative disorders, such as Alzheimer's disease, Lewy body dementia, or Parkinson's disease, the psychotic symptoms can occur. Now, here's an important point. It's only 10% of the cases where we do know a likely cause. The vast majority of cases are these primary psychotic disorders. And that matters for treatment, because if we do know the cause, we can remove the cause. We can support people to stop using these substances, or we can treat the underlying autoimmune disease. But if we don't know the cause, we can still treat the symptoms. And that is where antipsychotic drugs come in, alongside with other support to stabilize everyday life. Now, antipsychotic drugs have a quite interesting history, as so many drugs that we use in medicine, they were discovered by accident in the 1950s. A surgeon was testing medications to control allergic reactions during anesthesia, and they observed that patients who received a certain drug called chlorpromazine, they actually they appeared much calmer after they came out of surgery. So psychiatrists tried out this drug, and they found, to their surprise, that it specifically helped people with psychosis, and especially helped with delusions and hallucinations. So to this day, antipsychotic drugs are the mainstay of treatment for psychosis, and they do really work for hallucinations and delusions. Now, there are some caveats. They don't work for everyone, and they usually have to be taken long-term to keep the psychotic symptoms in check. It's a little bit similar to a blood pressure medication that you also usually have to take long-term, because once you stop taking it, your blood pressure may go up again. Now, they also can cause side effects. For example, they can make people feel tired, or they can cause weight gain. And while in psychiatry we do have ways to help people with these side effects can cause their own health problems. And maybe the most frustrating limitation to me as a scientist is that we still don't fully understand how they work. We do know that they interfere with the brain chemistry, especially with a signaling molecule called dopamine, but we don't understand how they actually reduce these hallucinations and delusions. So why does this all matter? Psychosis is actually much more common than you may think. Primary psychotic disorders have a lifetime prevalence of 3%. That means 3 in 100 people will experience psychosis throughout their lifetime. So if you're on a busy train, for example, the Northern Line in the morning, it means that there are 30 people with you on that train that have experience with psychosis or will have experience with psychosis during their life. Now, psychosis starts early in life, in the late teens, early 20s often. And that is just the time when people start building their adult lives, when they go to university or build their careers, form relationships. And that is what makes the impact of psychosis particularly profound. Now, importantly, sometimes people with psychosis will isolate themselves from their families, and that is because they have this altered sense of reality, and they feel, for example, that their family has turned against them. And they may sometimes even travel large distances to run away from the threats that they perceive in their environment. And sometimes people with psychosis can get so distressed that they may harm themselves, and the risk of suicide is greatly elevated. And I will share some resources in the end, but it is really important to get help for psychosis. And if you're in doubt, you can ask any medical professional. They can help you to find the right support for someone with psychosis. Now, many people do recover from psychosis, often with support and treatment. But many people also will have repeated episodes, or they will have symptoms in between these episodes. And here's one sobering fact. This has not dramatically changed over the past decades, since the discovery of antipsychotic drugs. And this is in contrast with, for example, cancer. When I was a child, which obviously was not that long ago, breast cancer was almost a death sentence. So getting a diagnosis of breast cancer meant that only 5% of the women would survive 10 years. This number has now increased to almost 80%, which is a huge success story. So why is it that cancer treatments have progressed so much, but psychosis treatments have somewhat stagnated? One of the reasons for that is that cancer research has had something that psychosis research has always lacked: reliable animal models. In cancer, we can implant a tumor into a mouse and then observe how it grows, how the cells divide, understand how the body reacts to it, and even test how treatments control tumor growth. And this is what has paved the way for the progress that we have seen in the treatments of many cancers. Now, psychosis is a little more complicated. We cannot just implant psychosis into a mouse. And this is due to two major reasons. Because psychosis comes with these very subjective symptoms, such as hallucinations and delusions, we need to find a way to know whether a mouse is experiencing psychosis. We cannot just ask the mouse, do you hear voices? So that is the first challenge. The second challenge is that we still then need to find a way to get the mouse into a state that has all the features of human psychosis. So we need to induce psychosis in a mouse. And these are the two bottlenecks that have kept psychosis research behind many other areas of medicine. Now, that is where our research comes in. We are, together with many other groups around the world, working on these two challenges. So, to measure psychosis in mice, we focus on perception as a measurable window into psychosis. The key idea is that perception results from integrating the sensory input that comes through our eyes and ears to the brain, together with our expectations that our brain generates. Now, look at this picture. Some of you may first see a vase, others may first see two faces. Hands up who saw a vase first. What face? Vase. And who saw two faces first? Okay, we have a clear vote here. But I think what it shows is that the same picture can evoke different perceptions, and that is because our brain not only uses that picture, but also our internal expectations. I will show you a video that illustrates that phenomenon very nicely. It's something that I recorded previously, so I will just play it.
A good example of how our expectation can overrule our senses in our perception is the McGurk effect. Listen carefully to what you hear when we view this man making a sound with his mouth. Now, look at what happens when we switch the picture. In every clip, you're only ever hearing ba with a B. If you close your eyes, you will hear ba again. Concentrate on the right-hand image. then the left image.
Ba, ba, ba.
This shows how perception is in fact malleable, not always reflecting an objective reality.
The man on the left appears to be saying va when actually it's ba. This is due to the shape of his mouth changing.
So how do you capture that in a scientific experiment? What we do is we get people to sit in front of a computer and we show them faint images and also play some faint tones. And sometimes the tones will indicate which image will be shown. And then we ask people, what did you hear? What did you see? How confident are you? And while people are doing that, we are recording their behavior, their responses, and we also sometimes record their brain activity using neuroimaging. And what we find again and again is that people with psychosis use their expectations differently in these tasks. So now we have a way to objectively measure the experience of psychosis in people. How do we translate that into a mouse? We cannot ask a mouse what it hears and what it sees, but we can build a task that does exactly that. So this is what we call an operand box. And inside you see a mouse, and there are these three, what we call choice ports. Inside each of these choice ports is a little spout where we can deliver a drop of water. And now we train the mouse, and whenever the mouse pokes into the center port of these, we may play a brief tone. And that now means to the mouse that it has to go, for example, to the right port, and then we will give it a little reward. Sometimes it will poke into the center and we don't play a tone, and now it has to go to the left port and we will give it a little reward. Now this allows us to capture instances where we don't play a tone, but the mouse reports hearing that tone and it waits confidently for a reward. And this is what we call hallucination-like perception. Now, the beauty of this is that we can do exactly the same thing in people. And when we do this in people, we see that people with hallucinations report hearing more of these tones that are not there and do so confidently. So now we have a way to bridge between the subjective experience of hallucinations and our objective measure of behavior that we can use in mice. So we can start to ask questions, such as what happens in the brain when perception tips into perceiving something that is not there. And one strong candidate here is dopamine. Dopamine is a signaling molecule in the brain that is released from a neuron into the synaptic cleft, which is the tiny gap between two neurons. The next neuron then receives that dopamine through dopamine receptors and triggers signaling. And that is how messages are passed on in the brain. Now, dopamine is particularly important in one area of the brain called the striatum, which is deep down in the brain. We've suspected for a very long time that dopamine in the striatum or dopamine signaling is high in psychosis, because all these antipsychotic drugs that were discovered by accident, they turned out to block these dopamine receptors. And imaging studies have shown that people with psychosis show signs of an increased dopamine production in that striatum. Now, that suggests that dopamine may be involved in tipping perception into perceiving something that is not there. How do we test that? And for that, we devised a computational model. It looks very complicated, but it's just like a tiny ChatGPT, but instead of answering your questions, it is specialized in perceiving the world just as our brain does. And it uses the same things that our brain does. It uses the sensory input, and together with the expectations that it derives from previous experiences. And now we can tell that model, please act as if dopamine was too high. And what this model then does, it starts to perceive things that are not there, and it starts to do that with high confidence. So this gives us a clear prediction. Dopamine may rise just as someone or some mouse starts perceiving tones that are not there. And now we went and tested that. And for that, we used these sensors. These are fluorescent sensors. And we can put them into the brain of a mouse. So here is half of a mouse brain. And the red and green kind of light that you see inside the brain, these are these sensors. And these sensors emit light whenever dopamine binds to them. So we can then implant a glass fiber on top of that and watch dopamine rise and fall as the mouse is doing the task. And when we do this, what we find is that indeed dopamine rises just as the mouse perceives a tone that is not there and does so with high confidence. So just as our model had predicted. Now, measuring is only half of the story. Ideally, we want to know whether dopamine is really causing these experiences. And for that, we use another technology that is called optogenetics, which sounds a little bit like science fiction. So we make dopamine neurons sensitive to light. That means now we again have a glass fiber in the brain, but now we shine light into the brain. And whenever we do shine the light into the brain, we can increase dopamine in that very brain region. And when we do that, we see that mice start hearing more tones that are not there and do so very confidently. And when we treat them with an antipsychotic drug, that drops back down to normal. So that suggests that dopamine really drives these unfounded perceptions, providing a powerful link between brain chemistry and psychosis-like experiences. So what does this mean? As I explained to you in the beginning, perception is the integration of sensory input that comes through our eyes and ears and our previous expectations. Now, when dopamine is high, perception starts to rely more on these expectations. And up to a degree, that can be quite useful because it can make perception sharper and more efficient. But when dopamine becomes too high, the brain crosses a threshold and starts to rely too much on these expectations, up to the point that perceptions will arise even if there's no stimulus out there. To give you an example, imagine you're walking through a dark forest and you hear a rustling in the leaves. You look, but because it's dark, you cannot make out what is causing this rustling. You start to rely on your expectations, and because you're a little scared and it's dark, you think there may be some danger there. And that is dopamine in action. And in that case, it's quite adaptive, because better to overreact than to miss a threat. Now imagine exactly the same situation, but in broad daylight. But dopamine is still pushing your brain towards relying more on expectations. So you walk through this forest, you again hear a rustling, and you look and there's a squirrel, but dopamine still tells you to rely more on your expectations, and you still start to think that there may be danger, and you start maybe seeing some shadows in between the tree trunks. So this is what we think may be happening in psychosis. So hallucinations and delusions don't come out of nowhere, but they come from the same machinery that creates perception, just tipped out of balance. Now, I think with what we now have is really an advance, because now we have this cross-species framework to study psychosis. So on the one hand, we have the symptoms, the subjective experiences that people have in psychosis that we can ask people about. And on the other hand, we have the brain mechanisms that we can study very, very well in mice. And in between, we have these perceptual behaviors that we can measure across both mice and people, and so we can bridge between the symptoms of psychosis and the mechanisms in the brain that create these unfounded perceptions. So that allows us to now bring the full power of neuroscience to psychosis research. We can measure and manipulate different neurotransmitters, such as dopamine, but we can do that for many other neurotransmitters, serotonin, acetylcholine, all of which may be involved in psychosis. We can record activity from thousands of neurons, and so we can watch the brain as these unfounded perceptions evolve. We can investigate how substances that are important or that are involved in psychosis trigger hallucinations. And we can study the impact of stress and sleep loss on the brain. And I think with that, we now can start to understand what is going on in the brain and how can we start to treat it to get to better treatments for psychosis. So this was about measuring psychosis in mice. Now, if we really want to understand what may be causing psychosis, we then need to go one step further, and we need to find a way to induce psychosis in a mouse, to model it in the laboratory so that we can study the causal mechanisms. And that is where we think the immune system may come in or may be useful. So recent years have shown that the immune system may play a role not only in these rare cases of autoimmune brain inflammation, but more broadly in primary psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia. For example, we know that genetic risk variants that increase the risk for schizophrenia are related to the immune system. We also know that people with schizophrenia have signs of inflammation in their blood. We know that having infections can increase the risk for later developing schizophrenia. And we know that autoimmune diseases, not only these rare autoimmune brain inflammations, but even autoimmune diseases that don't necessarily have anything to do with the body, for example, autoimmune stomach inflammation, can increase the risk for developing schizophrenia. And there are case reports that are also suggesting that the immune system may be involved. Now, before explaining these case reports, one note of caution. Case reports are when doctors provide a detailed account of a specific patients that they saw and that they found quite interesting. Now, case reports should never be taken as any evidence that a treatment works or does not work, because it's just one example. But they can start new research directions, and that is why I would like to share these two case reports. These are case reports of stem cell transplants. Now, a stem cell transplant is a procedure where one person's immune system is more or less replaced with another person's immune system. It's often used to treat blood cancers. The first case is of a young man who had schizophrenia that did not respond to any treatment. Now, this young man later on also developed blood cancer and therefore received a stem cell transplant. After receiving the stem cell transplant, so the immune system of another person, not only did his blood cancer disappear, but so did his schizophrenia symptoms. And this is very interesting, but it's even more interesting together with another case report that is kind of the opposite. This is of a case report of a man who did not have schizophrenia, but he developed blood cancer and urgently needed a stem cell transplant. And it was a life or death situation, so doctors went ahead and used the stem cells of this person's brother, who happened to have a lifelong history of schizophrenia. So when this person without schizophrenia received the stem cells from his brother with schizophrenia, he developed symptoms that looked very much like schizophrenia. So together, these two case reports suggest that at least in some cases, the immune system may play a role in psychosis. And that brings us to a bold hypothesis, which is that psychosis can be caused, at least in some cases, by a dysregulated immune system, where the body's own defenses turn against the brain. And this is something that we can study in the lab. The challenge, of course, now is to find out how and in whom the immune system may cause psychosis. And for that, we are running studies where we are asking people with psychosis and without psychosis to donate samples. And we then use the technology here at the Crick to very carefully look for changes in the immune system in psychosis. And that is great, but if we find a change in the immune system, we don't know whether this change is causing the psychosis or it may be just a consequence of psychosis. For example, because people with psychosis often do also take antipsychotic drugs, or they have all sorts of other differences that may explain these findings. So we then go one step further and replicate these changes in our mice and see whether they induce changes in their behavior. And so this way, we can really go from an individual person and their symptoms to the mechanisms in the lab. And we're running clinical studies here in London to further test that, both in collaboration with the North London NHS Trust and with the South London and Maudsley NHS Trust, and with a huge network of collaborators at King's College London and the McPin Foundation. And so we are asking people to come and give us some blood so that we can look for changes in the immune system. But we also ask them to participate in a lumbar puncture. A lumbar puncture is a little bit similar to an epidural. We insert a small needle at the back of at the lower back and get a few drops of the fluid that surrounds the brain and goes down all the way down to the spine. And this is very important for us because that fluid contains the immune cells that are in direct contact with the brain. So it allows us to study what is going on around the brain in psychosis. And we also ask people to fill out some questionnaires about their symptoms and to do our behavioral task, the hallucination-like perception task, on a computer. Now, this is where we need all your help. Psychosis research and clinical research more generally needs participants. We need families and clinicians to really spread the word. And we also always need participants without psychosis, because we always need control participants. So if you ever get a chance to participate in research, please think about it. It's really important so that we can combine this careful human research with studies in the lab to develop new treatments that really matter. So where does this leave us? Yeah, I think that we now have ways to study psychosis and to get at the mechanisms. So we can use these cross-species perceptual tasks to start to understand what is going on in the brain to produce these unfounded perceptions. And we can focus on the immune system and create models of psychosis in the lab to study the causes and get to better treatments. And I'm very optimistic about the future. And I think in 30 years from now on, we will have moved on from this current stagnation in psychosis treatments. And I hope that our work, together with many others' work, will allow us to identify precise brain mechanisms that we can target with very precise therapies. And we may be able to identify people in which we can use immune therapies to treat their psychosis. And with that, I would like to highlight that none of this work is actually mine. This is all a huge team effort. This is all done by my lab here at the Crick, which we call the Psychosis Collective. They are the people who are doing the actual hard work and brilliant science that you've seen glimpses of. And we rely very heavily on the science technology platforms at the Crick, which are our colleagues that give us access to state-of-the-art technology, world-class technology, so that we can bring that to psychosis research. And we have a huge network of collaborators from neuroscientists to immunologists to clinicians and lived experience experts. And last but not least, I would like to thank the participants in our research, clinicians and families who support our clinical research, and all the funders that fund our research. And I will leave this slide with some resources in case you need them. Thank you.